Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Lewis Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today I'd just like to talk about a few things in the news that have been bothering or even just interesting me. We'll see how many I remember and have the time to go through. The first one is in Massachusetts. There is a law being considered to ban the word bitch from public use. There would be a fine associated with it if you were using the word in a malicious intent, but it does state at some point that, intent would not actually be considered, which basically means if you go to if this law were to pass, though it seems to violate the First Amendment and probably won't, if you were to go to Massachusetts and say bitch, especially if you were to call someone a bitch, you would be fined, and if you didn't pay the fine because, free speech, you would potentially be jailed. This is very similar to laws we've seen all around the world, and isn't necessarily out of a global social norm. But one of the things that set America apart, and in my opinion has made the country greater than it would have otherwise been, is our free speech and our dedication to it. So I think, for a number of reasons, I've spoken out at length against censorship, that this is a dangerous thing. I've done an entire video on the subject of the word Whomps, which comes from an episode of Recess where, I forget which word it is, I think it might be crap, but basically the schools banned the kids from using a word. And I think it was crap because crap was a replacement for shit. And the main character basically, or the main character of that episode at least, TJ, talks about how kids will just come up with another word to express their frustration, because that's essentially what swear words are for, is expressing frustration, for the most part. And, I suppose degrading one another, but that's just a form of expressing frustration. I'm going to express frustration with my ability to pronounce these words in a minute. Anyway, he points out that you could just make up a word like whomps and start using it in place of whatever word is banned, and that bans like that are completely ineffectual and essentially, while it's not laid out in the episode, lead us down the path towards newspeak. It is, and I know this word is overused, but maybe there's a reason for that recently, quite Orwellian. It's the kind of thing you'd see in 1984. Words being banned, and eventually the ideas behind them, so that we're all good little proles. I don't know about you, but I would rather have a say, or at least an opinion in things, rather than just being a little follower of whatever Big Brother tells me to do. And anyone on especially the left who feels otherwise should consider that right now Big Brother is the big orange dick that they're all so terrified of. This brings me to the big orange dick's latest piece of dickery. And in this case I'm talking about sending troops to Syria, and from at least one description giving the leader of Syria a fair amount of control over how these troops are placed and dispositioned. So there's a number of reasons why I don't think, and why I've never thought, that we should be in war in the Middle East, and recently my opinion on that has only shifted somewhat. I still think that for the most part it's a good idea to attempt economic sanctions and other solutions to their problems first. I certainly think that at some point it becomes almost a moral obligation for a country, or for a group of countries like the United Nations, to start taking care of human rights violations that are in countries, regardless of whether or not they're in the UN, but especially any that are. And there are some horrible human rights violations going on in Saudi Arabia. So while I'm sure I haven't looked into the details. There's probably rebellion brewing, and we're helping put it down. I'm going to have to look into the reasoning behind it more, because I'll admit I know very little on the issue thus far. But I've heard Trump sending troops into Saudi Arabia after pulling ones out of Syria, and my immediate reaction is, well, oh God, no. I mean, unless we're sending them in there to take care of human rights violations and make them start treating each other like people, and if you're unclear on what I mean by that, just look up the American Dad bit where Francine sings about Saudi Arabia, because, well, it doesn't cover everything. As far as it comes to women's experience in the country, it does quite well. And so I'm not really for just giving the leader of Saudi Arabia access to American troops to put down potential insurrection. Maybe the rebels are fighting for a freer cause. Probably not. But regardless, I don't know if it's something that we should be getting involved in. But hey, that's like a third of the world's oil supply, and one of the reasons why the U.S. can sit in debt and still grow economically on a global scale is the petrodollar, which, if you don't understand the petrodollar, I'll have to explain it at some point, but other people have done great videos describing exactly how it helps stabilize the U.S. economy on a global scale, even as we put ourselves into debt, which we've definitely slowed down on in the last several years, believe it or not. So I'm not a fan of everything Trump does. He's impressed me by doing far better than I expected him to when he was elected, which really isn't saying much, but this is one that I have to take immediate umbrage with. Though, admittedly, I will look further into it and see what his reasoning is behind the troops and why they were asked for them in the first place. Speaking of troops, while this wasn't actually on my list to talk about, let's talk about the Kurds and the Turks for a moment, and the decision to pull out of Syria. Now, I was never for putting troops into Syria in the first place, and I think that when you've made a bad decision, going back on it is often a, good choice. Sargon of Akkad on his Akkad Daily channel did a video basically asking, do you want America to be the world police or not? I discussed it in one of my videos a little bit as well, because that's ultimately the question here. Do you want us to come in and, basically take over the area, become a little bit imperial, probably take over good sections of Turkey and Syria, put in a new set of leadership for both countries, ones that we at least believe will or could get along, maybe even just combine them into one country under American rule, and then, give it all back to the locals? Is that what you want? Do you want us to just come in, send troops on whatever side is the underdog, so that we're just in a constant state of warfare, that people who claim they don't want to go to war in the first place can complain about never ending, and then complain about anytime it looks like it might be? Or, do you want us to mind our own business, focus on our own problems and our own resources, and just leave things as they will be in the Middle East? Which we're not doing, since we're putting troops into Saudi Arabia, which is kind of hypocritical as we pull out of Syria. But ultimately speaking, Saudi Arabia is a much more beneficial and powerful ally to have than Syria or Turkey, and I'm sure that had something to do with the decision. It's understandable. Still, though, what's to be done with Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds? Well, personally, I think that if we're going to get involved in the Middle East, it should be on a broader scale, preferably with UN backing and maybe even another couple of countries involved, if we can get any of them off their asses to do anything for once, because ending war in the Middle East isn't something you can do by ending war between any two countries at a time. If you go around, it's like my dad says about fires. You can't put out a fire by pissing on the hot spots. If you just go around peeing wherever you see a flame, it's probably going to get out of control. You need to go and get a hose. Maybe the fire department, depending on the situation. But when we go around in the Middle East and solve things a conflict at a time, well, letting other conflicts wage, and once we've stabilized an area to relative peace, something which not just the Americans, several countries, the Brits, even the Russians have helped to do at different points in time, in different points in the Middle East, and then backed out and went off to their own country, back to their own countries, war ends up just breaking out again, or while we're dealing with one set of problems, another set spreads back into the areas of peace, and it just never ends. So we're going to have to take a little more of a broad approach, I believe, if we're going to handle things in the Middle East. And that's if we want to get involved, which personally, there's enough people living there who are suffering enough civil rights violations and now have enough access to information to see what these violations are really doing to them, thanks to the internet, that it might be time for, I'm not saying America could potentially do a lot of this on their own, and is probably the only country with the military force to handle an undertaking like this alone. But personally, I would love to see it be a global cooperative effort to clean up everyone's acts. I mean, if the UN, which the majority of the first world or civilized world is a part of, passes a series of, human rights laws or suggestions, they should probably be enforced on a global scale, or at least some of the major ones. We'd probably come up with a list, like not keeping each other as slaves and women having equal rights to men, that hopefully we can all agree on. And really, I know people talk about all cultures being equal but different, but if you're in a culture that just culturally or religiously doesn't believe that women can be equal to men, it just might be time for the rest of the world to help you change your opinion on that. And, well, I'm not for censorship of opinions, so I don't necessarily think that we should make people on an individual level stop believing their religious beliefs or anything like that. But on a legal governmental level, I definitely think that women should have some potential escape from their oppressive religions. This is something that does still happen even in countries where there are basically, if not equal rights. I mean, I'm in America, and I know plenty of people who've been drawn into not just religions, but sects of religions that operate essentially as cults. And some of these did not have equal rules for men and women. So I've seen groups of people in society in America choose to subject themselves to places where they were not treated equally. I mean, by their own choice, and sometimes through kind of a cult induction process that, while it was their own choice, was certainly something they were led into. That being said, anyone I've seen who was fairly intelligent or, rationally minded got out pretty quick, or eventually at least. And it definitely seemed like those sects went out and fairly aggressively looked for new believers because they've got a pretty high turnaround rate. So I definitely don't think that religious practices should be outlawed, or that, every single sect of society, like if there's a a neighborhood that has chosen in and of themselves to treat men and women differently, that's one thing. But on a legal governmental level, the gender which is being treated poorly or, being put beneath the other should have a right to leave and to go make a life somewhere where they are being treated equal. And I don't necessarily think open borders are a good idea for so many reasons, so I think really what we need to do is start fixing up some of these third world countries. We're certainly at a point where, without having to rebuild their infrastructure ourselves, we can give them the education and the technology to do it. But first we have to make sure that the human rights violations, which ultimately quite often hold them back as societies, are dealt with. Otherwise, well, you just don't give a genetic engineering machine and the knowledge of how to use it to people who believe that they're racially superior to others, for instance, which is something which is prevalent in certain areas of the world. Anyway, I've gone on about this subject a little bit longer than I'd planned, but hey, what do you know? Anyway, there was, moving on to something completely different, a transgender child, a biological male, so sex male, but gender potentially female, whose mother is currently insisting goes by the name Luna. I actually can't remember the boy's given name at birth now, but there was a custody battle, and the father said that when he had custody, it was part-time custody on both sides, the child in question showed no signs of wanting to be a girl, didn't ask or want to wear skirts or dresses, and figured that the mom was basically just saying, here, put this on, and taking advantage of the fact that kids of that age are pretty pliable. Well, a gender reassignment clinic gave her a signature of recommendation